Hello! This brief web tutorial will cover ideas in relation to the rhetorical situation to help you understand how to develop context and purpose in your writing. So the purpose of this particular graphic and this particular video is to go through ideas and strategies on how to use and apply the rhetorical situation in both academic writing as well as job-related writing after graduation. The goal is to effectively communicate using language, images, graphics, and more for a given audience, with the understanding that there's not always one direct audience. So I, as your English professor, am one kind of audience, but your biology professor is a different kind of audience with different textual, language, image, and graphic needs that you need to communicate to slightly differently or significantly differently depending on the particular topic. The secondary purpose of the rhetorical situation is to understand how language, graphics, and images are used to situate you as an audience, and to understand how source material uses language, graphics, and images to communicate effectively, or to communicate a purpose, or to communicate a very specific message, so that you can understand how communication functions and how it's already functioning around you. So obviously, why is this important? Why should you watch this video? The big thing is this is going to help you write effectively for your classes. It's going to get you to step back and before the brainstorming step to really think about who am I communicating to and what are the needs for that particular communication. So understanding from a rhetorical situation and using this particular graphic to help you can help you use the correct language, or it can help you shape your language in the way that's expected by that discipline so that you can communicate more effectively, so that your papers are read like you're communicating like a biologist, or all of the other ones that I commented on. So obviously in the work world, this is going to help you communicate effectively. So how is this done? The rhetorical situation provides an easy way to break down communication situations into smaller pieces so you can start to get an idea of what are the different pieces that I need to account for when I send this particular message. So let's go over what the graphic looks like. So there are a few different graphics if you Google rhetorical situation that you'll get. This is the one that I've created because I've found it the most helpful for teaching students to understand, as well as professionals in the work world. So when I've worked with professionals who need to communicate more effectively or to put together business documents, I take this similar approach. So the main goal of the rhetorical situation is to communicate purpose. You have a purpose to writing, and you have a purpose for why you're writing. And those two ideas influence a lot of the rest of this. So what is the text? What kind of language do you need to use? How do you need to use that? Who is the audience, and how is this particular purpose meaningful to them? How is this type of communication purposeful to that particular audience? And then you have context. What are all of the things that your audience knows? What are all the things that they know about text? What are all the things you know about that situation that need to be communicated through your particular choices? And then surrounding all of that, and also very similar to context, is culture. What is the culture of this particular organization? What is the culture of the classroom? What is the culture of the discipline? All of these things need to come together. So I'm going to briefly go through each of these a little bit further. What you need to keep in mind before we go through them individually is that none of them exists in a vacuum. Audience influences text, and text influences audience. Audience influences context, and context influences audience. Text influences context, context influences text. You get my drift. None of them can be separated, although we can think of them separately to help us put together our communication. But all of them influence each other. One of them is not more meaningful than the other. So keep that in mind as you're putting together your particular ideas. So the way you want to think about these particular conceptions of text is that essentially text can be anything that communicates. Body language, the fact that I use my hands constantly, communicates. The way that we hold ourselves communicates. So all of that comes together to become textual communication. How do each of those different pieces, and the pieces we choose to show, the pieces we don't. So the fact that I include my image in this particular video, how does that communicate something differently to you as a viewer of this video? How does that shape how you understand this online or hybrid class? How do we understand all of those different choices? So for papers, we want to understand what our writing says and what the writing looks like, because both of those influence how the text is perceived and how the text is understood and how the text argues for our message. Final essays, again, how can we break down the essay into more manageable pieces by understanding all of these different textual elements? And for multimedia projects, how do we appropriately communicate in a recognizable text to our non-academic audience or even to an academic audience? How do we make these particular choices, and what do our choices say about what we're trying to communicate? So the next piece we're going to look at is the context. So what is surrounding all of the text? What is going on around it? Which parts matter? What's the location? Is it digital, or is it within an office, or is it in front of a classroom? So you as the writer need to understand what is the situation surrounding your writing, and this also has a lot to do with your secondary sources. So you're going to hear a lot about plagiarism, and plagiarism is always a huge topic. Plagiarism is meaningful because you're stealing words from, in most cases, academics, and academics' careers are based on those particular words. So they can't exist within their institutions unless they're publishing words and they're talking in front of you. They're making those published words meaningful to their students and meaningful to other students. So when those are stolen and when those are used and when those are co-opted, that has very specific meaning to those particular people. When you move into the business world, the same thing might not hold true. So what is the situation, and how can you reuse very specific elements? So if you're tasked with writing a report on, I don't know, day 3 of a new job, the first thing you're going to do is look for other reports that people in previous positions or in similar positions to you within that organization have published, and you're going to reuse large elements of that text, changing specific parts to be meaningful to you if the business allows it. So you want to understand the situation surrounding your particular communication, so you know, what does that mean for plagiarism? What does that mean for what documents should look like? What does that mean for the kind of text I can use? How do I get my audience to understand the text within this particular situation? What needs to be accomplished? What needs to be discussed? So we're really getting at understanding the situation and then understanding everything surrounding that situation. Who counts as an expert? In academics, primary sources and secondary sources are what counts as expert opinions. That's not necessarily the case when you move into another field. So when I worked in education, we looked at transcript evaluation. So if we're dealing with an international transcript, the experts for international transcript evaluation are the departments of education or the ministries of education for those home countries. I don't necessarily want to rely on what a third party has said here in the United States. I want to know what the Chinese Ministry of Education says about that particular institution, or what the United Kingdom Ministry of Education says about that particular institution, so I can then figure out how to deal with that particular transcript. So I'm looking at who are experts within this particular context. And then what is considered appropriate language? How do you communicate? Why do you communicate in that particular way? The last piece is audience. So age, gender, experience, political beliefs, education, family, friends, hobbies, socioeconomic status. Any combination of these particular ideas within a particular context with specific text can have very specific meaning or can alienate our particular audience. So one of the easiest ways to understand this is to think about the commercials that we see on just normal television between 6 p.m. and 9 p.m. We see a big increase in ads for food. So Taco Bell ads, McDonald's ads, all of those advertisements start to increase in repetition between those time periods. Why would advertisements for food happen between 6 p.m. and 9 p.m.? You know, this should be a fairly obvious answer. This is when traditionally Americans eat dinner. So if we advertise fast food during dinner time and we see that and we're like, I'm kind of hungry. Hey, there's an ad for Taco Bell. There's one around the corner from me. Let's go get Taco Bell for dinner. It's making a lot of sense how very specific combinations of audience understanding as well as context and how the audience in that context are going to understand that text make meaning for a Taco Bell ad on TV at 7 p.m. at night. So audience can be broken down further into genres. Genres are traditionally understood within disciplines in very specific ways. So how and why do I write a biology paper in a specific way? How and why do I write a chemistry paper in a very specific way? What is the purpose of persuasion? What is the purpose of informing? What is the purpose of entertaining? What is the purpose of educating? Do we need a call to action? How do all of these come together within that particular context to make sense? Finally, we also want to consider the expectations of the audience. So what do they think the text is supposed to look like? This is where the different academic disciplines come in, very especially. So what does an English teacher expect an essay to look like? What does a biology professor expect an essay to look like? And then how do you meet those particular expectations? How do you structure your argument in a very specific way? How do you use specific language to communicate to an English professor versus a biology professor or versus a chemistry professor? What does the text sound like? What does it read like? What language is expected? What setup is expected? All of those are very specific to context and to text, but our audience can influence how we understand those two particular pieces. The same holds true for ethos, pathos, and logos. So ethos is the ethics or the way that we inform our audience of who we as the writer are. Pathos would be the more emotional appeals, and logos are the logical appeals. So in a biology paper, we're going to see a significant increase in logical appeals and a decrease in pathos appeals to develop our ethos as writers. In an English paper, we may see more pathos or we may not, depending on the purpose of that particular paper. We're trying to persuade somebody to do something, we might use more pathos or we might use fewer pathos. Whenever we see election cycles, like currently, we're going to see an increase in arguments and appeals to pathos and somewhat of a decrease in appeals to logos, because facts and statistics do not argue as heavily as the heart. So if we can get people to buy into our message through the heart, through feelings, through emotions, and then add statistics to support that, we might be more effective, depending on the audience, depending on the context. Okay, so there's a lot of depending in there, right? So let's do some examples to help you understand what that looks like. So the first one we have is what? Most of us recognize this as the traditional paper, and I use this one specifically because I talk so much about biology and chemistry, because those happen to be my minors from my undergrad days. In this particular presentation, this paper looks like an English essay. Not necessarily like a biology or a chemistry paper. Biology and chemistry papers have very specific formats to their beginning pages. So if you can see where my cursor is going right here, the placement of the title as well as the placement of the author name signal more English paper, more humanities-based paper, more social science paper than they do hard science paper. If you're in a social science that uses APA, again, this looks very much like MLA, not like APA. So already our context and our text, without having to read a single letter, are arguing in very specific ways for who we think our audience is. So if this is the paper you turn in a 400 level genetics class, your genetics professor might immediately look at it and say, I'm not the correct audience for this. This is not the way you put together a paper within this particular culture. So now your purpose has already been lost to that particular audience because you haven't communicated effectively. So we want to think about design as well as individual text. Okay, so the next one is a fun one because we need to have a little bit of lightheartedness in here. So T-Rex hates push-ups. We see memes like this on the internet all the time, and what we want to consider is that our audience is not as important because the internet is so vast, but our text, our context, our culture influence how we understand this most heavily. So in order to understand this, we as a culture understand education in a very specific way. We as students or we as internet users need to have been exposed to T-Rex. We need to have been exposed to some understanding of dinosaurs for this joke to be funny. That might not be the case in a non-American educational background. So what kinds of museums do students in other countries attend? What kinds of field trips do those particular students go on? Why do American students understand dinosaurs and dinosaur field trips? And how do we make sense of all of that? So we also want to consider audience when it's really vast may take a back seat, but culture is still really, really important to the purpose of our message, or even to communicating a joke to a specific audience in a specific way through our text. This might not be funny to international students the way it is to American students. You as American students or you as international students may have seen this so much that it's not funny anymore. So how do all of those things circulate, and how do we make sense of a communication using text, context, audience, culture, and purpose? finally, we do have differences between, and in this case I'm using traditional newspapers and e-reader newspapers or electronic newspapers to kind of compare the difference between electronic documents and paper copy documents, because there are differences in the text and the context and the culture. So in my classes, everything is submitted electronically and I submit feedback to you electronically. That's not always the case in humanities courses. Some humanities professors prefer hard copies. Some humanities professors are fine with the digital copies. So you need to make sense of how do these two differences argue in very specific ways. You can see in this particular case, because you can see the Gazette logo here and then you can see part of it right here, how do we understand the communication differently when one medium is selected over the other? Who do we expect the audience to be when we select one medium over the other? And then how does that actually function? So text, context, audience, culture, purpose. Very specific meanings and functions in the work world, in everyday life, as well as in academic papers. And the goal is to try to break down how we understand each of these pre-brainstorming and then during brainstorming, so that when you then start to organize your paper and you actually draft your paper and then you use a reverse outline to check the organization on your paper, all of those fit within the understanding of culture, the understanding of audience, the correct context, and the correct understanding of text, so that your purpose is communicated effectively. If you have any questions, please let me know.